Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar today. We are talking about equitable student outcomes and taking a closer look at the work that Aldine ISD is doing in this area. Here in Houston, we are more than just the fourth most populous city in the country. We are also often called the most diverse. That diversity of socioeconomics, religion, ethnicities, and culture spill over into our school districts, some of the largest in the nation. At Good Reason Houston, we are focused on helping school districts in the region improve their student outcomes with a particular focus on equity. We believe every Houston parent should send their child to school each day confident that they are safe and affirmed, learning the skills Texas requires, that colleges and universities prioritize, and that the workforce demands. But even more than that, parents must know that when their child graduates from a Houston public school, they are ready for a productive, choice filled future of limitless possibilities. But the data is clear that not all students in Houston are receiving the same education. 51% of Houston students attend a school rated C, D, or F by the Texas Education Agency. Of those students, children of color and economically disadvantaged children are more likely to attend a lower performing public school. Black students in the Houston area are 4 times more likely to attend a D or F school compared to their white peers. Economically disadvantaged students are 1.5 times more likely to attend a D or F school. And even within high performing schools, we see inequitable outcomes by race and economic status. Now let's pivot and talk about Aldine ISD, which is a district in Northeast Houston that is doing everything in their power to prove what's possible for every child. In 2018 and 19, which was the last year that we had accountability data, of the largest school districts in Texas, Aldine ISD had the highest economically disadvantaged population. 87% of their students are economically disadvantaged, yet the highest growth in student performance, as well as the second highest growth in school progress. So they're showing that it is possible to move the needle for all kids. However, they too have identified gaps in equity across their district and are working to model and accelerate progress for every child. Good Reason Houston has been working closely with Aldine ISD as they tackle race and equity work across the district. Sheleah Reed, who I have here, is Aldine's Chief Communications Officer and is serving as the executive sponsor for this work and is spearheading an integrated set of equity initiatives in partnership with the broader Aldine ISD leadership team. We partnered with Aldine on the launch of the Advancing Black Student Outcomes Project to conduct data analysis and a series of one-on-one and community conversations to understand the current experience of Black students and families, learn from other national and local organizations, and prioritize a set of actions to dramatically improve Black student outcomes as well as center equity in the district more broadly. So, with that, I'm really excited to dive into a conversation and learn more about this work. And so, thank you, Sheleah, so much for joining us today.
I'm so excited to be here. I remember the day I called you and said, Delicia, we're going to do this. And who knew, like, we're sharing a story with, um, the world. I'm very grateful to be here and very, very grateful that people are tuning in and want to learn more about the work we're doing in Aldi.
Agreed. So, why don't we start with you giving us a little bit of context on Aldine ISD? Tell us about your district and the population that you serve.
Sure. Excited to share all about Aldine. I think today we've been called A-Leaf, we've been called Austin, but I want you to know that AISD in my district is Aldine ISD. The superintendent kind of explains it best. If you've ever flown into Bush when you come to Houston, you're in the center of our district. So that gives you perspective of where we're sitting in Houston. And you described that we're a pretty diverse city, right? So diversity of race, economics, thought, and if you know anything about the city, diversity of like what could be next door to each other. We are a melting pot of ideas and thoughts. We have 67,000 students. That makes us one of the Big Ten in Texas. For some of us, if you think about the other large districts that doesn't seem like anything. But in Texas, most school districts are less than 3,500. So 67,000 students is a ton. We are a minority majority district. About 73 of our students are considered Hispanic or Latino. 22% of our students are African American. 34 of our percent of our students are English language learners. And then 9 out of 10 of our students are considered low socioeconomic. So we are a working district. Our families and parents, they work. Even our students work. They work to take care of themselves. So you put all that together and you have this melting pot of ideas. I also want to mention that we are in the northeast end of the city, like you said. Some of our schools are in the city and some are in the county. So experience. We have three major thoroughfares going through our city, 111 square miles of possibility.
That's great. So you said that Aldine is a melting pot, and you talked about some of the different demographics that make up
Mhm.
your student group. What sparked work specifically to focus on Black student outcomes?
I've been challenged by thinking about how I'm going to answer this question, and it changes every time. And I think what I will say is it all probably goes back to when the superintendent started. Most superintendents, when they enter in a new environment, they do a looking, listening, learning tour. So they're trying to understand, what is really going on in their, the city, the school district they're going to serve. If you think about Aldine, if you know anything about us, you probably heard that we've done well for minorities. Their minority students in Aldine have really succeeded over historically. That's what I knew. If you also think about, if you kind of think through or look up some history about Alden, you will hear that, or you'll see that is a district that's very much insular. Like you stay in Alden. And as and I think the superintendent who was in the state of Texas, she heard all those wonderful things and came. And as she was talking to people, the things weren't matching, right? We had some pretty disappointing student outcomes, and things were kind of just happening. I remember specifically a meeting where we were going over data, and I think maybe you or someone from your team shared a data point that was like, very few, if any, I think the number was 0, African American males were passing AP classes or passing the AP test. And you know everyone was kind of looking around like, what? So I remember that. And then fast forward, COVID happens. And as COVID happened, I think the game changed for everyone. You start looking and seeing how much inequities there are, not access to healthcare, no access to computers, and no access to food, right? So you're like, something's happening. And, the world was paused during COVID. And when the world is paused, I think you have to reflect on what is happening around you. And unfortunately, George Floyd was murdered, right? Right in front of our eyes. We all saw it. And I think that triggered something in the superintendent. I know it triggered something in me where you wonder, what are we really doing? What are we really coming to work for every day? And, can we continue to ignore some of the things? We had lots of conversations via text and email about what kind of statement we were going to put out. If you remember, everyone was putting out a statement from Nike to Ben and Jerry's. And as a school district and as a Black woman who had a male son, I really was challenged, like, what are we really going to do? The superintendent, my job as chief communications officer is to hold the superintendent to her role and also to make what she says become true. Mm-hmm. And as we talked about it, we just, what are we going to say? 2 statements came out, the one from Chicago Public Schools and the one from Prairie View A&M University. And both of those statements talked about the importance of celebrating and highlighting the achievements of Black students, and then also doing work around making their experience one that was amazing and helping grow those student outcomes. That triggered us to lay it all out. We laid out what we weren't doing, Delicia. We laid out what we thought we were doing, and then we said, here's what we're going to do. And we started with the BSO work. Yeah. That's the short version. There are other conversations and talking to people about, what was happening, but that really triggered the BSO work.
Yeah, that's good context. Mm-hmm. So you said at the top of this call, you remember the day you called, and I remember that day well. Mm-hmm. It was actually the day of George Floyd's funeral. Mm-hmm. So I guess two questions for you. One, if could you share a little bit about why you wanted kind of Good Reason Houston's outside support to help facilitate this process, and then two, talk a little bit about the process that we went through together.
Yeah, you have a to-do list. I have sticky here, I have a notebook over here, and you really do your best to get through those things. And you also know that there are emergencies that happen. There are competing priorities. And what we have found is that in our relationship, Good Reason Houston has really allowed us to say, here's the big picture goal. Now, can you help us break that down into chunk-sized pieces that really allow us to go deep but be effective? Because sometimes you can go deep and you get stuck in that hole and just keep digging, and you never have an outcome.
Mhm.
I remember when we worked on the strategic plan, it was like, well, we need to finish it, but let me edit this one word. Let me change this page. Let's switch the order. But your ability to help us effectively organize and project manage was something that I knew we needed. The other thing is that sometimes you get too close to a project, you fall in love.
Mhm.
And you want to sit and you want to think. And I've spent time at a university and you want to be thoughtful and academic and you want to, socialize. But sometimes you just got to move the work forward. And I think that that's one of the reasons why you guys were the first people on my mind, like, help us do this. Also, it's not too far fetched. I mean, your mission is to ensure every student has access to high quality schools. Every student includes Black students.
Mhm.
So it sounds like it was a match already. The timing just was appropriate. And I'm glad you answered, and I'm glad, Alex said, oh, yeah, we can do that.
Yeah, yeah.
Let's talk about that process. So we had a lot of conversations about, like, what do we want to do? We knew that the Black student experience in Aldine needed to be explored. I read some information about when Dr. Goffney was doing her looking and listening and learning tour, and what the family's perspectives were. And there was one African American family who kind of talked about their experience, and they talked about these great schools. And then there was another, extreme where there was a student saying, there are no great schools, it's not good. And something has to be in the middle of that. I also recognize when I looked at our um, the population of teachers, or what the demographic breakdown of our teachers were, a lot of our teachers were African American. And so if you think about, equity data, or especially creating equitable outcomes or creating a new landscape in school districts, many are talking about hiring teachers of color. Well, we had already done that. So something wasn't balancing, and I thought, well, let's dig deeper into that. And then I also knew that we needed to hear the voices of those who were in the classroom, right? The counselors, the teachers, the principals, trying to understand what their experience was. And then we need to hear from the students and the families. And so I think the journey started with us just listening, kind of listening and evaluating what is happening inside Aldine. So it was like a look at what we have. Let's evaluate what we have. And then when you're doing anything, I think you have to look around you. There are a lot of people talking about equity, a lot of chief equity officers being named, lots of new philanthropic resources being kind of shelved out. But who was already doing this well? What organizations were taking on this work? So we looked at those. And then ultimately, you can't just sit in the information. What were we going to do next? And that was the third part. Like, what does that future look like for us? I accidentally looked at the participant list and saw that some of the BSO members were on here. And I remember the frustration when they're like, okay, what do we do next? Okay, what are we going to do? And, you know, all this data you create and find is great, but like, what are you going to do with it? And I think that that's really the place where we found a good sweet spot between you guys saying, hey, we showed you all this. Here's some potential next steps, but what can the district handle? What can your system handle? So the third piece was the what do we do next?
Yep. You mentioned the BSO group. Early on, you identified the need to really bring a collective along in this journey that represented the district to help guide the work. Can you just speak a little bit about why you thought that was important, what the makeup why you made up that group the way that you did, and how you think that what's the role that group played in pushing this work forward?
I think that we all have our own experience. you know, two Black women talking to each other. We have very different experiences into life, and so creating the Black Student Outcomes group, that group for me, I wanted people who had been in Aldine for a long period of time. I wanted people who were new to Aldine. I wanted every level. I wanted a principal. I wanted a chief. I wanted a teacher. I wanted to make sure we had a Black male in the room, a Hispanic female. I wanted a whole group of people so we could hear their voice. And, you know, it couldn't just be about Black students, right? It had to be about their experience. And everyone plays a part in that. So creating that group, we needed to have dialogue. Um, I run one thing, and that's my house, right? Like, so I pay the bills there, hey husband, but I really don't. You know what I mean? But that's what I'm responsible for. I
Mhm.
don't get to have a reign about what happens here. I need other people who can help shape and guide what we're doing and hear their voice. I mean, I was not in Aldine 30 years ago. I've never been a classroom teacher, so I don't know that experience. I've also not been a parent of a student in Aldine. So having all of those experiences was important as we were building out what could be.
Yeah. I'm reflecting on our journey together and the Black student outcomes work in particular. And I feel like there was a moment that really got the conversation going. And I'm thinking about the work around the orthodoxies. So for those who might not have be familiar with that word, what we did was really think about what are the ways in which the district operates or school systems in general operate. And they're just doing it because it's the way things have always been done, and then really pushing ourselves to think about how do we challenge those assumptions, challenge those old ways of doing. And sometimes it makes sense, sometimes it doesn't.
Mhm.
But I know that that sparked a whole set of conversations for you that you've been broadened even outside of the Black student outcomes group. And so I'm just curious if you could talk about like what that exercise meant to you and how you use that to catalyze even broader conversations across the district.
Yeah, orthodoxies are such an interesting word, but I really remember the days where we had to go in the bank to cash a check or to make a deposit, and now there's ATMs, right? Or summer school. My favorite is that you don't wear white after Labor Day. Like, why do we keep that? Like, and then we learned, like, oh, it's because you were in the fields, or because it was the snow melted and it made your clothes dirty. And if you apply that to school district, why do we have summers off? What? Why does that even make sense? Why are we recruiting from XYZ school? We've only gotten 3 teachers from that same school every year, but yet, like, it's on the schedule, you go back. And what we realized is that some of the orthodoxies made no sense, but they were just things that were always done. They're not contributing to student outcomes. They're not contributing to, student experience. They're not even making better teachers. It's just something that's always been done. And it did create a lot of dialogue. I mean, some people's jobs were like, why do we have that role? um, for me, I remember what it did was is I kept hearing, or I kept feeling like I was missing the feelings of Black staff members, like the collective. And it was like, well, what are they saying? It led me to have another whole group outside of the BSO work to have a whole nother conversation with just Black staff. Like, tell me what's happening. And then we did it with our executive leadership team. Like, why are things this way, or do you think it should be undone? And I think what it has allowed us to challenge the status quo. We don't have to do things the way they've always been done. We really need to do things that are best for students. That should be the goal, not just because it's always
Yeah, great. I think that's a key learning from this work. Can you
been done.
expand on other insights and learnings from this project?
Yeah, there was one that really stood out. Um, two really. The first one was that, the question was, why are you focusing on one set of students? Why is it Black students that you're focused on as opposed to, let's just say, Asian students? Or, why are you doing that? And when we were looking around and talking to other people, um, be reminded that I'm a communicator. So there's a group of communications folks. We talk to each other. We have Facebook groups. We text, like, what are y'all doing about this? I didn't see an equity group for schools. So we had to go find community and talk to them about their experience and where they are in their journey. And one person we talked to, she said, you do what's best for the least of us, right? And what you get from that benefits the whole.
Mhm.
And the one thing she pointed out was, when you go to the airport with your suitcase, you're not carrying the suitcase up the stairs, right? You're not like, oh, let me pick it up. Instead, you're probably using the elevator. Well, if you remember, the elevator was not designed for able bodied people, it was designed for handicapped. But
Mhm.
we're all benefiting from something that was designed for someone who didn't have full access.
Mhm.
And she reminded me that we always have to look to those who are on the fray, those who are marginalized, those who are outside the collective group, and do what's best for them. And it will always benefit the group. And that really changed it for me. So when people ask, why are you focusing on Black students? Well, right now in Aldine, Black students are showing up as those who are marginalized, as those who are outside, as those who are not being served. So when we move them into the group, there will be someone else. And now we have a framework that we can use. So that's one. The second thing was, I asked, when I Google chief equity officer, I Google equity work, people of color show up. That's who's leading the work. And I said, is it always Black and brown people who are leading the work? And she said, no, you have to have the right heart to do the work. And
Mhm.
you also have to have the thick skin, and you have to be comfortable about who you are. And, I remember thinking, oh, I don't think this is for me. But then, I look at my son and I'm like, oh, no, no, this is for me, because if I can do this for him, I can do this for other people. Everyone should have as much access as he has, as much access as anyone has. And so it has to be about the right heart, the right spirit. And then you also have to have the right permissions.
Mhm.
And permission isn't like, oh, Delicia, you can do this. It's just like, well, maybe you're not asking this time, or, you're pushing people, building the relationships. And so that gives you the permission. So those two things really stand out for me.
That's great. And one of the things that I've noticed too is that the district has been really intentional about saying, okay, yes, there was a point in time we want to do this project, we want to understand the outcomes and move the needle for Black students, but it also opened up a broader conversation around equity that your whole leadership team has now stepped in to kind of own and drive together. So can you just speak a little bit about the connection between the BSO work specifically and how it's moved into a broader equity agenda for the district?
Yeah, I think I remember another conversation I was having with someone about the iceberg, and how you can't just do things that chip off the top of the iceberg. So random acts of equity. You
Mhm.
have to do things that really affect the bottom. Why is it even created that way? And what I learned is that equity projects are happening across the district. Our focus on literacy, a new approach to literacy, is an equity project, right? But it's not under my preview. It's under the chief academic officer.
Mhm.
How you're hiring, where you're recruiting. Any of our new schools are all things to ensure that we have equity across our district. What I found is that by having this Black student outcomes work, we gave permission for people to even start talking about race, for people to even start talking about color, to put a name on what they're experiencing. And everyone is approaching it very differently and coming with what they have, but all of the conversations are valued. I think about the chief financial officer and how, her experience is different than mine, but we both can talk about, what can we do differently to serve students. So now I think, she's really focused on how are we spending our resources.
Mhm.
I think about the chief academic officer and how he really shows up and thinks about, like, what are my privileges, and how am I, how are they showing up in my conversations? And what we thought was just an exploration of the Black student, you know, experience in Aldine has really allowed people to, open up and talk about um, the importance of celebrating culture and race, and seeing people for who they are, and not trying to make them all or everything.
Yeah. what I would add to that too is it's celebrating race, but it's also even naming race.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we weren't talking about it.
It's been on a journey to actually acknowledge and open conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So you said earlier when you were talking about the phases of work, the third part was really about what are we going to do about it? What are you going to do about it? What are some of the actions that are emerging from this work, and what's coming next for the district?
Yeah, so we really identified that like discipline, our students were, African American students were over disciplined. We identified that African American students were under identified for
GT?
gifted and talented, and over identified for special education. So it's stuff we knew, but it wasn't surface. So I know special ed is working on an audit. I know that you know, the SEL department and counseling, they're looking at dress code, which leads ultimately to, some of those discipline. Our chief of police is thinking about like, arrests and how his team shows up. So the next thing, what are we going to do about it? So we've identified some beliefs, and we use those beliefs to kind of surface what we think is important. And one of the things we think is really important is, finding looking at equity as a whole in the district. We've done curriculum audits, we've done special ed audits, but we've never looked and said, let's cut the cake this way and look at equity. So the next step for us is to do a district-wide equity audit. We've identified a partner who we'd like to move forward with, who will really focus on systems and family community engagement and curriculum from an equity lens. And we'd like to use those findings to change and reevaluate. Those are long term, right? But immediate steps have been, budgeting. What are we doing for the schools that are showing up, far behind? We are looking at, creating new school models as part of the system of great schools. We're always evaluating our schools and looking, how do we change and reconstitute, reimagine the school systems. And so we're using that to identify what we know Black and brown students, right, have challenges, especially Black in this case. So when we redesign these schools, how are we focused on those students? Mm-hmm. As you mentioned, I'm kind of like the executive owner of this work. What that just means is that there are equity projects happening across the board. My job is to make sure they're focused and to also lift the work so we can communicate with our broader audience.
That's great. In our last minute, what advice would you offer to other districts or educators who are listening in today?
Yeah, I'm a deadline-driven person, and so I do something, I cross it off the list. I do something, I cross it off the list. This has been hard. You can't cross equity off the list. You don't put it on the list and then say, oh, I'm gonna do that Friday. You have to be paying attention. Equity is a journey, and it's something that you and everyone else have to adopt and appreciate and know that it's you have to time it, it's long, but it's a beautiful struggle, because while you're thinking you're going to do one thing, you're seeing change happening other places. And also, if you are leading this kind of work or starting or want to, you have to look for the small wins. Mm-hmm. You're not going to change a system overnight. The system was created to do what it's doing. You have to uncreate the system. So you have to find things and undo them. Yeah. And that undoing is going to be taxing, but look for the wins. It's a beautiful struggle. Absolutely a struggle.
That's great. Thank you. Then that's really inspiring and motivating words as we wrap up this call. So that is unfortunately all the time we have for today. That did go by really quickly. I do want to thank Sheleah again for taking the time to join us and talk about such an important topic. I see there's a question in the chat about the availability of this recording, and yes, it will go on the Good Reason Houston website shortly, so you'll be able to look at it, share it with any folks that you think might be interested in it. And I just want to acknowledge, like, to what Sheleah just said, there's so much more work to do, and we recognize that. And so we're excited to continue to partner with Aldine and other districts to really take these issues on head on. If you are a district that is embarking on this journey, feel free to reach out to me at Delicia at goodreasonhouston.org if you want to talk about how we might partner to help you think about engaging in this work as well. And last, I'll put in a plug for our webinars. Please do go to goodreasonhouston.org/events. If you're interested in joining more conversations in the future. I appreciate you all. Thanks, Sheleah.
Bye. Thank you, Delicia.
Bye.